Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, in researching old photographs, I find it best to be prepared for the unexpected. You never know where the research rabbit hole is going to lead. This image here led me to the immediate aftermath of John Brown's raid in 1859, to Fredrick Douglas, and to a quick thinking telegrapher who Douglas thanked for saving his life. So here's the story. It begins with this image, which I recently added to my collection. It's a portrait of a bearded young man cloaked in a blanket and holding his cane and hat. The reason I added this image to my collection is because the blanket, which he wears as a shawl, that's pretty unusual in Civil War era photography. I had a hunch that he may have been connected in some way to the U.S. Christian Commission or the Sanitary Commission, both philanthropic organizations that raised huge amounts of money for supplies and services for U.S. soldiers during the war years. The wearing of the shawl, I imagined, showed this young man headed off to serve in some Union occupied southern city. Now, he's identified on the back, and I'm showing you the back of it now so you can see what I see. There's a name, and it appears to be Reverend Henry Bridge. And there's some other words that it belongs, it's a property of somebody else. I focused in on Reverend Henry Bridge and did a bunch of checking on all the databases, Ancestry.com, Find a Grave, newspapers.com. I certainly found some individuals that had the name Henry Bridge, and even two that were ministers, but I couldn't quite connect it to the Civil War era and to any way of being involved with any of the philanthropic organizations. So I wasn't able to make a connection between Bridge and any clergyman that seemed to make sense for this time period and his apparent age, a relatively young man. So at this moment in time, I consider the details of his life to be unknown. Doesn't mean I've given up. I will probably dig in a little bit later at some future point and try to find out who he is. Maybe you all can even help. While we're here, take a look at the imprint in the very middle of the mount of this image. It says J.W. Hearn, H-U-R-N, number 1319 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia. This is the photographer's imprint, and Civil War era paper photographs like this one, technically albumin photographs, and this the carte de visite format, about the size of a baseball card, very, very popular and very common for the photographer to put his or her imprint on the back. Now, as it happens, this is the fifth example of a J.W. Hearn image in my collection. And I've seen a number of others in my travels. In Philadelphia, he was clearly a prolific photographer during the war years. Now, for some reason or other, I've never spent any time looking into his story. So I did. And I got to tell you, it was quite a thrill. Here's what I learned. John White Hearn, that's the JW, John White Hearn was born in England in 1823 and came to America as a young man. He worked as a telegraph operator in Rochester, New York when he first arrived, and then later moved to Philadelphia, which is where you see the imprint on this image. This all happened before the Civil War. Sometime about the start of hostilities or soon after, he becomes a working photographer in Philadelphia. Now, politically, Hearn was a staunch and ardent abolitionist, strongly believed in freedom for enslaved people. In fact, he was a huge admirer of Fredrick Douglas. We'll pause here for a second because I want to show you this image. This is an image of Douglas in 1862, taken by John White Hearn. So imagine he's an admirer of Douglas and has the opportunity to have Douglas sit for a photograph in his gallery. This particular portrait is part of the collection of the Library of Congress. Now, years after Hearn took this photograph, he told the story of his role in warning Douglas of an arrest order issued after the John Brown raid. This story originally appeared in newspapers in 1882, exactly 20 years after this photograph was made. And that article was then published in 1983 in an article by Doris Lanier in Maryland Historical Magazine. The title is Fredrick Douglass's Escape After Harper's Ferry. In Doris's article, she includes this newspaper reference to Hearn being interviewed and telling the story how he helped alert Douglas. So here's the quotes where Hearn talks about his experience. Now, this is 1859, and John Brown has just raided Harper's Ferry. Quote, Hearn says, "At that time, I was a telegraph operator located in Philadelphia," continued Mr. Hearn, "and when I received the dispatch, I was frightened nearly out of my wits. As I was an ardent admirer of the great ex-slave who was doing all that mortal could do to agitate the anti-slavery question, I resolved to warn Douglas of his impending fate, no matter what the result might be to me. The news had just been spread throughout the country of the bold action of John Brown and his intrepid followers in taking the little town of Harper's Ferry. Everybody was excited and public feeling ran high. Before the intelligence came that Brown had been captured, the dispatch, which I mentioned, was sent by the sheriff of Franklin County, Pennsylvania, to the sheriff of Philadelphia, informing him that Douglas had been one of the leading conspirators and requesting that he should be immediately apprehended. Though I knew it was illegal to do so, I quietly put the dispatch in my pocket and, asking another operator to take my place, started on my search for Fred Douglas. I went directly to Miller McKim, the secretary of the Contraband Underground Fugitive Railway Office in Philadelphia, and inquired for my man. Mr. McKim hesitated to tell me, whereupon I showed him the dispatch and promised him not to allow it to be delivered within 3 hours. I told him I would not do this unless he agreed to get Douglas out of the state. This he readily assented to, for it was his business to spirit escaped slaves beyond the reach of authorities. I returned to the telegraph office and kept a sharp lookout for similar dispatches. None arrived, however, and when the allotted time expired, I sent the belated message to its destination. In the meantime, those entrusted with my secret saw Douglas and urged him to leave the town as quickly as possible. He was loath to do so at first, but the expostulations of friends overcame his objections, and in an hour he left on a railroad train which placed a gap of 40 miles between him and Philadelphia every hour. He reached his home in Rochester, New York in safety, destroyed the compromising documents, and then packed his gripsack and started for Canada. It was fortunate for him that he left as soon as he did, for immediately after his departure from Rochester, his home was surrounded by officers. End quote. So that's Hearn telling the story of how the sheriff was of Franklin County, Pennsylvania, was alerting the sheriff in Philadelphia about arresting Fredrick Douglass for his alleged connection to the John Brown raid as a conspirator, and that he needed to be arrested. And here is Hearn, who received the telegraph and knew that he was supposed to deliver it immediately, but he waited 3 hours to give Douglas a chance to be alerted and to leave Philadelphia to get back to his home in Rochester. Now, here's a little bit of a twist in the story. Keep in mind that Hearn gives that interview in 1882. Well, that's an important date because the previous year, Douglas's autobiography titled Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, written by himself, was first published. It's pretty clear that Frederick Douglass learned of Hearn's story probably through the newspaper reports. A number of newspapers picked up the story, the interview with Hearn, and Douglas then writes a letter to Hearn on June 12th of 1882 from Washington, D.C. A typewritten transcript of that letter is part of the collections of the New York Public Library. Here's what Douglas wrote to John White Hearn. So here we go. John W. Hearn, Esquire, my dear old friend, you have done me a real service, and I hasten to acknowledge it. My book is miserably defective, and having been stereotyped, no corrections can be easily made. I am glad to have the exact truth of my escape from Philadelphia in John Brown Times made known. It seems now that I was in more danger than at the time of writing I supposed. You, I have no doubt, saved my life, for had I been once in the hands of the government, I should have been sent into Virginia, and although I was not guilty of the raid upon Harper's Ferry, in the then temper of the public mind and the authorities of the state, the fact that I was a friend of John Brown and had brought him money at Chambersburg, that's in Pennsylvania, would have been sufficient to hang me. Had I known of your whereabouts, I should have written to you while preparing this part of my book. Kindest regards and best wishes, your friend, Frederick Douglas. Hearn received the letter. How he reacted, I have yet to be able to discover, but one can imagine he was pleased to know that his testimony, his eyewitness account in the newspapers made its way to Douglas, and the great man, the man that he admired so much, wrote him a letter to tell him so. Hearn lived another 5 years, dying in 1887. So he was able to see a little bit of Douglas's continued life and service and career. So there's the story of John White Hearn, photographer, telegraph operator, and someone who helped Frederick Douglass, according to Douglas, saved his life. Take care. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.